because I do think it is Marco's inevitable end, unfortunately, actually. But we'll see how it all plays out next week. But I do think Marco is about to die, unfortunately. What is up, fellow General Hospital viewers? Here to talk about yesterday's Friday episode of the show, which for me was a mixed bag. On one hand, there was action, which is good for a Friday episode, in my opinion. It's something the other soaps could do better, just more action in general on some of these other soaps, but especially on Friday episodes. But at the same time, there was some stuff in yesterday's Friday episode that kind of left me scratching my head, and we should probably begin with Jason out there as a hitman, just kind of out in the open, wanting to shoot Cullum, but he's out in broad daylight in all black. It just kind of looked ridiculous that he was just standing there for a while because he couldn't get a good shot in on Cullum with his scope because Brennan kept getting in the way. But it also seemed as though he was having doubts about wanting to actually go through with this. Maybe Jason has actually gotten softer at his old age and is his more of his younger self again. I don't know, but it was a little ridiculous, him standing out there dressed in all black in broad daylight. Meanwhile, Cullum and Brennan were discussing that they had discounted Jason Morgan, or Cullum thinks that, because they got to figure out if Jason is still involved with Britt. And then Cullum started to kind of put it together that Jack Brennan might be protecting them both and is working with Jason. Brennan kind of called his bluff, saying he can't go to the WSB with no evidence about that. Meanwhile, when we got back to where Jason was standing outside with his big old gun, he is no longer there. He decided he had to go to Danny's basketball game, which he promised he would do. We'll circle back to that, though. Nathan stopped by to see Dante in this episode to ask if he's heard from Lulu over the last hour because she might have a problem with the WSB. Nathan was talking about Cullum's visit to see Lulu about Charlotte and Valentine, and Nathan was saying that something was off and saying we don't want that Cullum guy near Lulu. I felt like this was Nathan maybe knowing more about Cullum than we do. All this suspicion that this is not the real Nathan kind of maybe plays into that too. Dante was not very open to hearing any of this, though, and was kind of brushing off all of Nathan's concerns. And then later, Dante had a confrontation with Jason because of the WSB. So I don't know if Dante will have second thoughts at some point. Here is one issue that I do have with this big old story that is involving a lot of people right now. That's just the character of Britt in general. Rocco stopped by to see Britt, and she has to tell him she may be leaving town, although she kind of played it off that she wasn't. I lost interest in all of these scenes with Britt in this episode until the end when she was on the pier. But since I've been reviewing again and watching more consistently over the last couple of weeks, but even back in November and December when I was watching more consistently too, I'd kind of zone out of scenes with the Britt character. It's just never a character I've ever bought the hype for. And so all of these characters kind of putting their asses on the line for Britt is really a big weakness with the story for me overall, because I don't care about Britt. So that is an issue that I do have with this big storyline. It all kind of revolves around her, and it's a bit much for a character that really doesn't have it. Sorry, but she doesn't have it. Anyway, Lucas and Marco were still talking after Marco came through for Lucas and got those drugs that Britt needs to stay alive. And Marco is thinking that his father will protect him, but Lucas was asking what about Cullum. Marco thinks that Cullum can't risk doing anything to him without proof because it should upset Sidwell, one would think. And then they were planning a romantic night alone. Marco wanted to take a tour of the house on the lake since they're going to have to move soon anyway. And much like I've been saying all week, but even last week too, they are beating that drum very hard that something is going to happen to Marco, because before Marco left Lucas to go to work, he left with an I love you, with Lucas saying it back, and then Marco ran into Brad on the way out, so it was just not looking good for Marco again in this episode. Brad came by to whine to Lucas about how Lucas needs to do the right thing for his friend Britt. He knows that Lucas and Britt didn't get along in the past, but he needs Lucas to come through for her now. And Lucas told Brad he will come through for her. I hope this wasn't a hint that they're going to circle back to this coupling after Marco is likely offed, because Lucas and Brad have never done it for me, and they won't do it for me here, because even in these scenes, the actor that plays Brad is not a great actor, for one. But also, there's no chemistry. Let's just be for real. Anyway, Britt headed to the pier to meet Lucas, and it seemed as though someone may have followed her and was watching her when Lucas arrived with the drugs. And Britt was so thankful to Lucas, and Lucas said, "Don't thank me, thank Marco." The someone watching them was Gio. Alexis was exhausted after her meeting with Tracy in Thursday's episode, because they share a relative and they were having that little argument about Danny. Alexis also in this episode had to learn about basketball for Danny because she wanted to support him, especially if Jason's going to be leaving. That's when Marco arrived for some work. And Alexis went to the basketball game and ran into Jason. So Jason was trying to come through for Danny. And Alexis was asking if Danny will be staying with her because she thinks it is best and not staying with Tracy and the Quartermains. But that's when Dante arrived saying they have a problem. We saw in one of the last episodes, though, Jason telling Danny that Danny would be staying with Alexis. But it seems he hasn't told Alexis that yet. But Dante arrived needing to take Jason to the station. Jason didn't want to go before he sees his son. He wanted to come through for Danny and be at the basketball game, but Dante says Jason needs to come now. It's not a warrant that's coming from the PCPD, but it is coming from the WSB. So it seems like Cullum may have tried to do something to Jason here. Maybe a distraction or to make sure he can't leave. I don't know. But a lot of things in this episode did kind of play into this big storyline. And then at the end, we have Marco alone at work when Cullum arrives and shuts the door behind him, which was our good Friday cliffhanger, which is something I do appreciate about GH. They do cliffhangers at least half the time. And this was a good one because I do think it is Marco's inevitable end. Unfortunately, actually, but we'll see how it all plays out next week. But I do think Marco is about to die, unfortunately. The other things happening in this episode kind of revolved around Michael and his hooker, because the hooker was meeting with Kristina and telling Kristina about her and Michael getting spontaneous in the gatehouse and how Olivia walked in on Michael. And these scenes, though, between Kristina and Jacinda were them chem testing these two together, probably because she was showering Kristina with compliments. And even though Kristina was saying she's not ready for a relationship, it seemed like Kristina was enjoying those compliments from our resident hooker. Meanwhile, Olivia wanted that big ol' house meeting with the Quartermains to talk about Michael. And when Michael arrived, they kind of bombarded him. Well, Olivia did, and then Ned jumped in with a refresher on what it means to live in a house with children, because they got to set an example for children because they're like sponges, and they don't like Michael's choices of places to have sex. And Michael says he's an adult and was just, having his fun with Jacinda in a place where he thought there was privacy. But it turns out were more concerned about Michael's choice of partners because Jacinda used to be a sex worker. Michael's argument was that she has a job now and it's Nina's assistant, and he doesn't judge sex workers and says his grandma Bobby was one at one point, so do they think they're better than her too? I mean, Olivia and Ned were acting ridiculous, very holier than thou. I think it was plot driven because Olivia and Ned have done some ridiculous stuff in the past. But honestly, in real life, a lot of people grow older and they get more uppity and conservative and they judge people for things that they used to do in the past. So it's actually very accurate. In the end, though, Michael went to interrupt Kristina and his hooker and wanted to kiss Jacinda in front of everyone, which made Kristina make some looks, probably maybe a little jealous. I don't know. So I guess we have a Michael, Kristina, and Jacinda triangle. Not sure how I feel about it, honestly. But I'm going to give it some time, let it play out, and see if they actually do go there with Kristina and Jacinda or not. All right, that was our Friday. I do think overall it was a good enough Friday episode, even though the Jason out there in broad daylight was a lot. And even though Britt is a giant weakness for me in the main storyline because I am not invested in her as a character. But it was a solid Friday episode because we had action, we have movement, we had a cliffhanger that likely leads to a character's death. So I can't complain. They're giving more than most of these other soaps are giving me. You know, Bold and the Beautiful is giving me drama, but there's like zero substance to that drama.